let it roll?
Yeah, well, I moved to New York from Atlanta in 1970. I came here in March of 1970 to take over the United Negro College Fund as its executive director. And the charge as its executive is to raise money. So in order to raise money, you have to go where the money is. And the money for the United Negro College Fund was individual wealthy people, major corporations, foundations, and in some instances, the government. Both Ely and I are from Georgia, and I knew who he was. I did not know him. He knew a little bit about who I was, but did not know me. And I even forget who introduced us. But from the first time we met, we've been going steady ever since. And I liked him, he liked me, and we were proud Southerners despite the very different experiences that we had had growing up in the South. But we found this common ground, and we talked about it and we laughed about it. And then I needed a corporate campaign chairman. And so I called him up and I said, I want to come to see you. And he said, okay. And so I went and I said, you know, we Georgians have to help each other out. And it's your time to help me. And there'll come a time when I can help you. But you have to help me. He said, what do you want me to do? I said, I want you to be my corporate campaign chairman. And he said, what does that mean? I said, it means you got to go with me around the country to raise money for the United Negro College Fund. And you got to write letters, we'll draft the letters and all of that. He said, I'm your man. It was that plain, that simple, that easy. In the meantime, we would meet for breakfast at the University Club at 54th and 5th. Back in the day, the University Club actually had grits for breakfast. I was there last week, there are no grits. It's changed. It's lost some of its basic stuff. Ely Calloway and I grew up on grits, and so we would meet at the University Club and have grits. And Ely Calloway and another Southerner, Morris Abram, actually sponsored me for membership in the University Club. And then I found out who Ely really was. We had a luncheon set up hosted by Billy, the chairman of Trust Company of Georgia. And he invited all of the big business people to come to this lunch to hear Ely Calloway and Vernon Jordan talk. I said to Ely that I always stayed with my mother when I came to town, and I said, you on your own. And the morning of the lunch, he called me 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. He said, Vernon, I am in the emergency room at Emory University. I said, what's wrong with you? He says, I have gallstones. And shortly, they're going to operate on me, so I can't come to the lunch. I said, well, but of course you can't come to the lunch. And I got to the lunch early, said to Billy Stern of Trust Company, I said, Ely Calloway can't come. He said, I've heard from him. And the program proceeded. I said, I will make this speech for both of us. And before I was introduced, Billy Stern said, Ely Calloway has taken sick, but I would like to play this audio. This was an audio that he made as he lay in preparation for an operation on the gallstones. And he simply said, I am about to go into the operating room for an emergency operation because I have gallstones. And I'm supposed to be there at the Marriott with my friend and fellow Georgian, Vernon Jordan. And I can't be there, but I want to say to this audience of businessmen, the United Negro College Fund is a very important organization, and it's important to this country, it's important to black people, and we have to support it. 40 colleges and 40,000 students, and before I go into this operating room, I want to urge you to support it, and I want to urge you to support my friend Vernon Jordan. I mean, it was so dramatic. It was so Ely. And you could hear in his voice that he was enjoying himself, despite the fact that he was about to go into the operating room. And then I followed up with a speak, and it was a good lunch. I've never had an experience like that, and I've never forgotten it as it relates to my friend Ely Calloway.
So I must interrupt and ask, did it help?
Of course.
Because I got to believe everybody in there had to be...
Oh yeah, we got the money. We got the money. And then Ely and I saw a lot of each other. Lunch, breakfast. And nobody much knows this, Ely went to the chairman of Burlington and proposed that Burlington put Marsh Abram, who was Jewish, and me, who was black, on the board of Burlington. Ely never told me this, but I know it. And the then chairman thought that Ely was out of his mind. And subsequent thereto, Ely suggested to the chairman that he, the chairman, had been chairman long enough and that it was his time because he was the president and chief operating officer. I think that was on a Monday. On Tuesday, the CEO called him in and fired him. And he told me about it. I said, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to California. He went to California. He called me up and said, I'm going into the wine business. I said, you got to be out of your mind. What do you know about wine? He said, well, I know what I like. I have good taste. And I went out there to see him. I saw the first grapes in the ground. And that's when I found out he could cook. He was fantastic grilling frozen steak. And he would fire up this side of the grill, and this side of the grill would be no fire, and he would move that steak. And when he finished, it was a steak worth eating.
If I may interrupt for 1 second, Nicholas told us this morning that Ely had actually planted grapes in California to 2 years before he left Burlington.
I didn't know that.
Because, and I didn't know it either, and I was saying, pretty big shift to just leave New York and go to California and play grapes. He said, no, they were planted. And he said, some way he must have known that there was going to come an end to his tenure at Burlington, and this was what he was preparing. And I had never heard that from anybody.
Yeah, I've never heard that. When I heard that he was going in the grape business, I said, are you sure you're going to like it in Napa Valley? He said, this is not in Napa Valley. This is in Temecula. I said, where the hell is Temecula? And these are the mountains. And between these mountains, the air from the sea creates in Temecula a kind of Napa Valley weather that makes it conducive to wines. And he introduced me to the guy who was the wine man. We stayed there 2 or 3 days and had just a fantastic time with him. And then the wine came on the market, and he went to clubs like the University Club, the Minneapolis Club, and he did the selling. He was a fantastic businessman, but marketing, selling was at the very core of him. He was good at that. He was good at that. He was so good at it that I've always thought of Ely as a guy who can tell you to go to hell in such a way that you look forward to the trip. That was Ely Callaway. And he sold this wine everywhere. I mean, it was doing well. There was a white wine, there was a red wine. There was a dessert wine named for Nancy. I think I only drank it once, so I can't speak to the quality. But the wine itself was I thought, very good, and I ordered it when I thought it was appropriate to push the wine. And then he called up one day and said, I'm selling it. Hiram Walker has offered me a price that I cannot refuse. And so I said, what are you going to do? He said, I'll let you know. And then he went into the golf business, and he was in California. I was around the world, and I didn't talk to him as much. And then he called me up one day, and he said, you remember you came to me and asked me to do something for the college fund? I said, yeah, I remember that. He said, do you believe in reciprocity? I said, sure, I believe in reciprocity. What do you want? He said, I want you to come on the board of Callaway Golf. I said, I'm your man. And I went, and it was different from my other corporate experiences, all of which were standard, traditional corporate entities. When I went on the Callaway board, it was different in the sense that Callaway was Callaway. Ely Callaway was the company. He had a board, he had a general counsel, he had the various committees that you were supposed to have, but Ely Callaway was Callaway Golf. And there is no question about that. I understood it better than some of the board members, I think, understood it. But he was the company. And he wallowed in it. He totally immersed himself in it. and knew every detail about everything, and surrounded himself with good people. What's the research guy's name?
Dick Helmstetter.
Dick Helmstetter. Dick Helmstetter understood what he was doing. And Ely relied on him. The other real advantage of being on the board is that it gave me time with Ely when I went to Carlsbad. We would eat breakfast and we would eat lunch, and what is interesting, I never played golf with him.
No kid.
We never played golf. We never played golf, but we were always sitting around and having lunch or dinner, talking about the book that he wanted to write, talking about politics, talking about the South, talking about his kids, talking about my kids. I treasure and cherish that friendship.
Well, a lot of very rich comments there, and I knew you were close with him for a long time, from my time at the company. But as to sit across from me here and hear it come out of you so eloquently, it just takes it to another level for me. I'll just make one comment quickly about golf. I'm not sure I ever played golf with Ely either, but we spent time on the golf course, and we called it Ely golf. You'd hit a tee shot, and another one, until you'd had enough. Then you might go pick all of those up, drop them out there in a fairway, and hit a 7-wood. I probably did that 20 times with him. I never saw the man putt. We just pick up balls and go to the next hole, which
Yeah.
might not be, if we were on the third hole, might not be the fourth hole that we would go to next. Might be the seventh hole.
Yeah.
You know, and you just spent time out on the golf course. It was, he just did what he was going to do.
I was also privileged that Ely took me into his confidence about his personal relationships. Whether he was courting or married, he made me one with whom he counseled. And sometimes he did not like the counsel, but he always asked for it. And at various times followed my advice.
So the Ely Callaway of the Burlington era, relatively still a young man, rising through the ranks at the world's largest textile company, obviously good at all he touched and did. It's very successful in the corporate world, and then he shifts into the truest, rawest entrepreneurial, I wear every hat kind of thing to make a go of grapes coming up out of the ground, and then again in a golf company. Very disparate careers, but I'm sure there's a bridge from the experience he gained in the corporate world that he carried through to and fueled his entrepreneurial success.
Well, I think he was fundamentally an entrepreneur.
Always.
And he was a builder, and I think he had a vision of Burlington that he never got to implement. But he he was also a guy who believed that the moving finger writes, and having written moves on. And that's what he did after Burlington. He didn't wallow in it. He didn't look or ask for pity. He moved on to the next thing because he had all of this energy and intellect and curiosity. I always thought going into the ball business was a mistake. I think I still believe that. And there was some debate about it, but Ely wanted to go into the ball business. And what made me understand it is my thought about all of the balls that went into the water on the fourth hole at Robert Trent Jones where I play golf. They were my balls. And they were not retrievable. And so I said, every time I lost the ball, maybe Ely has a point.
Were you going to say something?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, I
sorry.
just like the story.
Oh,
That's
good.
great.
Oh, good. So, what stood out in his I guess you'd say, collection of attributes in the business world? Obviously, integrity, honesty, and vision are ones that pop up
Yeah,
all the time.
well, I think what stood out with him is that he was curious. He was inquisitive. He wanted to know, what do you have to do to this grape to make it a quality grape and therefore a quality wine? Remember that there was a club called the Elywood. Right? They don't make it anymore. I miss it, and I have a couple of them somewhere in my garage. I don't know where they are now. But he was inquisitive. He was curious, and I think that's a tribute to his intellect. That he was asking and he was questioning and he was. I mean, you think about all the research that went into that Callaway golf ball. That was totally different from any other research, and also very expensive.
I'll add one technical fact, if you will, about the golf ball. No golf ball had ever been built like that before.
That's right.
And that golf ball caused the market leader, Titleist, to completely abandon the wound golf ball manufacturing process and make balls like Ely was making. Now, they had the market share and infrastructure to transition it quickly and maintain their market share. Ely's an upstart. But he shook up the market leader to completely abandon a 50-year-old process, 30-year-old process.
Yeah.
That was really significant in the ball world back then.
The if you take him as a whole, and I said this in the two eulogies that I gave, that Ely Callaway taught me that friendship was the medicine of life. And I think all of his friends would testify to that. Yeah, they would all testify to that.
That's a wonderful, wonderful quote. I'm sure through your close friendship with him, you saw him deal with difficult things from time to time, be it business challenges, really not trying to get into any personal issues or anything, but focusing on the business side of things. It often appeared that little rattled him. He always seemed to be a step or 20 ahead of a lot of people in figuring out how to get something done. And he wasn't afraid.
He was not afraid. I remember when he was, what's the golfer's name from Arkansas?
John Daly.
John Daly. He made a deal with John Daly. And the deal was, I'll support you as long as you don't drink. When John Daly violated the deal, he's a man of his word. He saw something in Daly that Daly did not see in himself. And he supported him. And there was a tournament in Washington, and he called me and said, I want you to come and have breakfast with Daly. You can help him. And we went and had breakfast, and I mean, he treated Daly like he was his own son with a problem. And when Daly violated the pact, he was finished. Whatever living in the South was for Ely, he left it in the South. I don't think Bo Calloway would admit to this, Bo the cousin. But I think the Callaways all found it stunning that I was given the eulogy at Callaway Gardens for Ely Callaway. Nobody said anything. But I've been around long enough to read it, people. It was just, they weren't uncomfortable with it. It was just contrary to tradition. I often think about him.
I'm sure you do.
And the only time that I've been back to the company was when I came for that dedication. For any kind of formal event, I was out there to get a putter in March, but I just went to the place and worked with that guy.
One other thing that seems to be notable in some ways, and we're not sure how we're at the end we're going to address this, but Ely had repeated efforts of trying to find a suitable CEO to take the reins, and never truly succeeded in choosing someone that could.
Well, if I had to list one failure on Ely's part, he failed to prepare a successor. And I think that was in part because he thought he had more time than he did. And he has not really been succeeded at Callaway. I mean, there was just no question about it. And I don't believe in the theory that individuals are not replaceable. But if you're going to make the case, you could say that Ely has not yet been replaced. And that is in the sense of his creativity, his being able to think up the idea and then carry it to its full completion. And in many ways, it was difficult to train a successor because he was so large and so enjoyed every aspect of it. And I don't know whom he would have selected to be a successor. I think what you're doing is important for one very important reason, and that is that Ely wanted his contribution to be accounted for. He will relish the telling of his story. And I don't mean in the sense that he was a publicity hound. I don't mean that at all. But he believed that he made a substantial contribution to his first business. Burlington. And then when he left, he went in totally a different direction. Wine, golf. That's all I got, guys.
Well, that was wonderful. I'm going to just ask you one
Sure.
follow-up question. So, 1870, you meet Ely Calloway. Obviously, we all experience matures as we grow older. Our point of view sometimes soften or change or whatever. What was the biggest difference from the Ely Calloway you met in 1970 to the last time you saw him prior to his passing?
That's an interesting question. He was the same guy.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, he was the same guy. He liked good food, good wine, loved good clothes. And in California, he dressed differently from the way he dressed at Burlington. He wore a turtleneck to work, but he was in Southern California and that was acceptable. But it was a cashmere jacket. He was consistently the same, in my judgment. I made arrangements for him to go to the White House. Well, he loved that. He had a special thing for Clinton. But he had a special thing for power. He understood it. And wanted to be within proximate location to it. and he had a contribution to make. You know, he was.
Nicholas told a story today about being 10 years old and sitting in the front row at the Ed Sullivan show when the Beatles came to play. And of course, Burlington Industries was the sponsor of the Ed Sullivan show, and there was Ely with his camera taking pictures and everything. And he talked very similarly about being in those kinds of places. He had a knack for being there. And it's interesting that you bring up basically the same sentence so quickly here.
Yeah.
Yeah. What can we, you know him forever. I knew him for a much shorter period of time. I reflect on things Ely said or did many times as I'm trying to figure things out. And in my group, we often talked about when you're using your judgment, you should have a little Ely Calloway on your shoulder and say, what would he want me to do? What guidance would he give me? What really is the essence of what we can learn from a man like Ely? It's enormous, but
Well,
there's a fabric of that.
first, he cared about people. Secondly, he was also a real patriot. He loved America. He served in World War II. He was an officer. He was very proud of that. He also stole the girlfriend of his fellow officer and his buddy. His buddy arranged for them to have a date in Philadelphia. And they went out, his buddy's girlfriend and the girlfriend, to date for Ely on a Friday night. On Saturday night, his buddy called his girlfriend and said, "What are we going to do tonight?" And she essentially said, "I don't know what you're going to do tonight, but I'm going out with Ely." And that was his first wife. Yeah. I don't think that ought to be on the tape, but
We'll be careful, but
so there was a rogue quality to him. But with no criminal intent. Does that make any sense?
absolutely.
But it is the same thing he did to the golf game when he created Big Bertha. I don't know what else I can say, guys.
You've done wonderful. You've done more than we could have asked for, and
Yeah.
we enjoy it and we appreciate it a lot.
So nobody knows where Nancy is.
I don't think so.
Mr. Jordan, can I ask you one question?
Sure.
If you're comfortable answering it. We've got some great answers on this. Did Ely run the name Big Bertha by you before he released the project?
No, he did not. I think when I went on the board, Big Bertha was already. When did I go on the board?
About
Do you?
95?
Yeah, I think Big Bertha was already established.
Oh, yeah. And the company had gone public, and that was established. Absolutely. Well, to a person, everybody has said they advised Ely not to use that name.
Oh, really?
They thought it would not resonate, and that it would cause more stir. That he said, just hit it and tell me if you hit it better. If you hit it better, it'll work.
But you know, he liked having his buddies around him. You know who else was on the board? He's dead now, but he ran Merrill Lynch. He lived in New Jersey. God, I can't remember his name.
Oh, I remember him very well. Well, we're plugging along. We've got a few more weeks of interviews here, and we'll keep you posted on any significant steps in our progress here, because I think you.
And you look very good in general. You have not aged. You have not aged a bit.
A little more salt and pepper, but not so bad.
You look fantastic. So you're living well.
Thank you.
And it's wonderful that you're both doing this. So I thank you personally.
Well, you're welcome.
It's
Gentlemen, we are rolling, so it's
Okay.
we are ready to go in your capable hands.
would you like me to look at you?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So I think it's appropriate to start this dialogue by the correct place being in the beginning. I mean, early remembrances of Ely, life at home, when you started to notice what kind of made him tick, what drove him, anything along those lines will get us started, and we'll take it from there.
Golf was the thread that ran throughout Ely's life. And my first memory in life is in our house in Darien. In the library, there was a lithograph of Bobby Jones on the 18th green at St. Andrews winning the Grand Slam. And it was inscribed from Bobby Jones to Ely and my mother, Jean. And that's literally my first memory. So golf was there from the beginning in my life, and it was already very important in his life. And I also remember learning how to walk on the 18th fairway of Weyburn Country Club in Darien, Connecticut, where he was a member, and he and my mother in 1958, I believe, won the couples championship. Many people, of course, the world knows him for Callaway Golf, but people don't realize that what became Callaway Golf had roots that were lifelong, 50 years in the making.
That's very, very interesting. So, how old were you walking the fairway there? Just to kind of
2.
Yeah, very good. So, at that time, Ely was at Burlington Industries.
Yes.
I believe. And so he'd come home from his day at the office with his briefcase and his coat and tie. And how did he turn off Ely, the businessman, and turn on Ely, the...
Or not come home. He worked all the time. And that was one of the defining characteristics of Ely, was that he loved to work. And so I have specific memories of him as a very young boy, but they were few and far between because he was working all the time. And he told me a story once in that regard, because I asked him late in life, given that he was from Georgia, given that he was Bobby Jones' cousin, and Bobby Jones was his hero, and that Ely was a lifelong great golfer, I wondered why. I asked him, why aren't you a member at Augusta? And he said, well, in 1958, Bobby Jones and Cliff Roberts asked me to join. And I said no. What? Why did you say no? And he said, well, at the time, my boss, Spencer Love, who was the president of Burlington Industries, had pinpointed me as his successor, and he said, Ely, you don't have time to play golf. It takes far too much time. And Spencer was apparently a superb tennis player. That was his sport, so I don't think he had much tolerance for the game of golf. So he said, you gotta keep your nose to the grindstone. You don't have time to waste on golf. And he said, and it turned out he was right. He said, because being a member at Augusta, it's such a short season, and you hardly ever get to go there. And then the rest of the year, you just have people calling you up and trying to get guest privileges. So he never joined Augusta, and he also worked really hard.
Gentlemen, I apologize to interrupt. Nicholas, I'm going to put a little bit of powder on your forehead.
Oh, okay. Am I shiny?
Just a little bit. But we'll catch it right out of the gate here.
I'll tell you very quickly, my job interview, the Homesteader, Bruce Parker,
Wow. What year was that? 90? 93.
turtleneck, tweed jacket, middle of August, leaning back in the chair.
With his hands in.
And he says, and I'll do a very bad Ely imitation, but with total respect. Now, Mike, how much golf do you play? Well, we all call him Mr. C. Mr. C, you know, when I'm busy, I don't get to play very much, but in the summertime, when my work is much lower, I get to play a little bit more golf. So it goes on and on. The interview goes on, and he comes back to it, and he says, Mike, tell me, what is your handicap? I said, well, Mr. C,
What's your
I play a lot of
handicap?
golf on the low single handicap.
Low single digits.
Yeah. And, but, you know, I really don't, when I'm busy and I don't get to play, I don't even need a handicap. You know, I'm not even playing golf, but it goes up to high single digit kind of thing. And I looked at him and I knew right where he was going. And for once in my life, and I said, Mr. C, if you're wondering if I'll have any problem keeping my job my number one priority, I assure you I won't.
And he said, you're hired. Good answer, yeah. You were smart, because and I heard stories about that too. Because, of course, so many people, you must have seen this again and again, so many people came to Callaway Golf in their midlife crisis thinking that golf was going to be the answer to life, and he'd always say to them, if you think you're going to have any time to play golf, you're wrong. I also have to tell you the story about the first time I played with the Big Bertha with him. I mean, we can do that.
We're good, guys.
Now, I mean, 'cause I don't know if you're going chronologically, but
I'm going to make a note of that, and we'll hit that when we get to kind of
okay.
there. So Ely's busy and rising quickly in Burlington and doing great things and driven to drive the success of Burlington. And things begin to change at Burlington. And for him, from a career standpoint and from a family standpoint, it ends in a very big change of him leaving and moving to California. Leading up to that change, you're a young man, your dad's working hard. What did you notice about, as you were growing up, noticing his character, his drive, his passion? Really talk about what you observed in his behavior.
My parents were divorced, and I lived in Pennsylvania. He lived in Connecticut and New York City, but I would visit him very often. So he was indelibly associated with New York to me. He was New York. And there's a TV show to prove it now, Mad Men. I mean, Ely was that show was modeled on him. But everything about New York at that time, mid-century New York, and the rise of American corporate culture and in its great years, and he helped to build, at the time, a great corporation, great textile corporation, which became the largest textile company in the world. I believe now doesn't even exist, gone. And that's another theme that Ely saw ahead. He had the most extraordinary sense of timing in terms of economic, societal, cultural, and lifestyle trends. And he saw ahead usually somewhere between 10 and 20 years, and he did that consistently. So, but what he was able to do was to both capture the zeitgeist, be a part of it, but then also to change and move on. He never remained in one place in his life. I think, and to a great deal of his success is thanks to that, to his ability to evolve, to change, to in the words of the Apple campaign, to think different, and then to act on it. He was very brave, very courageous in that regard. And it was a great lesson for me. So for me, he typified New York. He built Burlington House on Avenue of the Americas when all that parade of corporate giants were Time Warner and trying to think of who else. It was that era, and Burlington House became a mecca because he had the idea to tell the story of how textiles are made by creating a textile mill. And it was brilliant marketing. It was brilliant communication. I mean, he was a master of what's known now as MarCom, marketing and communications. And it was always also about making things clear to people, to the masses, of bringing a great product to the masses and connecting them to it and to the story behind it. He loved that, the story behind a product almost more than anything. So Burlington House opened, and I remember there's a picture of Ely with John Lindsay, the mayor at the time, and it became the most, I believe, the most popular tourist destination for a few years in New York City, more than the Statue of Liberty or Rockefeller Center. But my memories of New York, and I think one reason I'm a New Yorker, was that he exemplified and symbolized that to me. And I'd come in, we'd go ice skating in Rockefeller Center, and we went to, he loved Broadway shows. The great era of Broadway musical with Rodgers and Hammerstein, went to the first performance of The Sound of Music with Mary Martin. A number of years later, in 1965, Burlington was the corporate sponsor of the Ed Sullivan Show. And so when the Beatles came to play, he got us tickets in the front row. So I saw the first and the second Beatles appearance of the Ed Sullivan Show, and he was right up there photographing it. As an amateur, he was a great amateur photographer. He loved photography, another thing that I've inherited. I'm a lifelong photographer. But he knew how important it was. He knew that it was a moment in history. And so he got us to participate in it. It was just amazing. And actually, to digress a bit, I've always kept the contact sheets. He used a Hasselblad, the great camera of the time, medium format, 2¼ square, and he photographed everything with that. And you know, his career as a amateur photographer is under-acknowledged. He photographed, John Kennedy a few weeks before he died. Photographed the Beatles. Photographed his travels at the Acropolis, and Yusuf Karsh, the photographer. So I kept the contact sheets from that performance, and I had a chance to meet Paul McCartney a few years ago at the opening of the Cirque du Soleil production of Beatles' Love. And I tried to think of something that I could bring to connect to him. So I brought the contact sheets with me. And I did get a chance to meet him after the performance and sat down with him. And I told him about attending that. It was the second performance, because that was the first performance of yesterday. And I used Ely's contact sheets and photographs as my way to introduce myself. And I said, it was an amazing night, and I'll never forget it. I was 10 years old. And he said, I'll never forget it either, mate. And he said, that was the first time I performed yesterday anywhere. And he said, I hadn't really practiced it. And it was in the intermission right before going on. And he said it was my first also solo performance without John, Paul, and Ringo. So he said I was all on my own. And I was practicing the chords during the television break. And of course, meanwhile, I and Ely were out in the audience, and Ely was photographing it all. But he said, so I was strumming the chords, and one of the stagehands comes up to me and said, "Well, you nervous, son?" And he said, "I was 23 years old," and he said I was cocky, and he said, so I said, "No, I'm not nervous." And the stagehand said, "Well, that's good, because you're about to go out in front of the largest television audience in history, 60 million people." and Paul went. So that was a great. So there were, I think Diana even describes Ely as the Zelig of modern history, because it seems as though he was everywhere there was something significant. Ely was not far away, and in many cases he was a part of making history. So New York was a great era. He loved it. He had an apartment West 55th Street, just a block or two from Burlington House. He also had his main residence in New Canaan, Connecticut, which is famous for its mid-century architecture. In fact, there's a group of architects called the Harvard Five who built several hundred houses in New Canaan, and Ely had one of the great ones. It was not a Mies house, who had, of course, was the architect of Seagram, the Seagram building, but it was a Mies. I think it's part of the group of Mies van der Rohe. And the reason I mention it is that I've spent my life in the arts, in design, architecture, media, and even though Ely was not known for his he wasn't in the arts per se, but I always think of him as an artist. He was an artist of business. He was an artist of life. In the art of life, he took such great pleasure. So I grew up in the previous decade in a colonial revival traditional house in Darien. But then when he had his Mad Men era, he lived in the coolest house, really, I think I have ever seen. This modern mid-century house, and he really designed and had built a magnificent Japanese water garden all around it. He spent years landscaping it with 10-ton boulders, and so this house was just also a kind of expression of him and of this era. So he was very stylish. Now, one of the other things that was part of all of this was fashion. And one thing that people who knew him in late life knew that he was a good dresser, But people who knew him all his life knew he was one of the great dressers of all time. He would have been, if he had stayed in New York, he would have been on the W or the Esquire best dressed men's list. He had and because he was in the textile business, so he knew everything about fabrics and tailoring and cut, and he loved it. And the other thing that I always remember is going out to dinner with Ely. Dinner with Ely was an unforgettable experience because he was so interested and so curious about people that he really used it as an occasion to learn. That dinners became a kind of symposium, whoever he was with. And he'd do the same with his children and with me. And it was a great occasion to talk and talk and talk. I think my favorite memories are having dinner with Ely. And at that time, when I was 10, 12, 14, in my teens, in the 60s, that meant going to all the great restaurants, to the Four Seasons restaurant, that was his favorite, to the 21 Club, Gallagher's Steakhouse. Those were his three favorites. And so because your question was about how driven he was, and he was, but he also was a great bon vivant. And a great connoisseur of the finer things in life, and he took such pleasure out of them.
Two phenomenal words. I love both those words. Wonderful way to put that. Great stories. I can see your eyes light up telling those stories about the dinners. I almost don't want to leave that part.
Okay.
But let's for just a moment. So you become a young man. It's time to go to college, and my sense is that Ely was a big believer in education. And I wonder how he may have provided any guidance to you in choosing what direction you might start in. Some of us start in one place and then totally different. But how did he interact with that, his view of education? And my guess is that his early life experiences had a big impact in shaping ultimately his career and his character. Whether it was the Quartermaster Corps or Emory University or whatever it might be. And I'm also hot wiring this a bit and guessing I wanted to pass that on to you. Come on, get out there.
Well, if he did, he must have passed it on right from the start, because I was a young scholar, and studying hard was probably the thing that I cared about most. But I don't ever remember him saying, "Now you ought to, study hard and be a good student." Maybe because I always was, and I wanted. I mean, I loved learning. Now maybe I got that from him. He was someone who loved learning, but what was great, it was not about academic learning. It was about learning out in the world. But I spent all my time studying, and I don't actually ever remember him even applauding me for it. I mean, I don't think he needed to because I think he knew, well, that's covered. Nikki is going to be a scholar, and I was headed toward the academic life. I don't think that he cared much about. He was not an intellectual. That's the interesting thing. But he had a great mind. But it was a mind of action, and rather than of ivory tower kind of learning. But he had such phenomenal curiosity. He was a great reader. He loved biography more than anything. And he had probably 80% of the books in his library were biography, because he loved the great men, mostly the great men, and he studied them throughout history. And Bobby Jones was his number one hero, both as a man and as an athlete. But Churchill. I also remember one of my very first memories is seeing Churchill's A History of World War II. It was multi-volume, started with, I think, The Gathering Storm was the title. So I remember looking at books that were Ely's as I'm speaking about the age of 2 and 3. So I was imbued with the sense of learning, of books, and but interestingly, when I went to a traditional boarding school, Phillips Exeter Academy, and then decided to take an untraditional route and applied to the inaugural class of Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. And he was involved with Amherst, I think, on the first, maybe the first development committee. And so he supported my decision to go to an experimental school. Then I decided I wanted to get a real education, and I didn't want to be a guinea pig. So at the time, I was interested in classics and comparative literature, but also I was already deeply engaged as a photographer. So I had a dual life, studying photography and the liberal arts, the arts and the humanities. And I decided to apply to Harvard for 2 reasons. 1, because it had the great classics department, and 2, because there was one of the great photographers and teachers of the era over at MIT named Minor White, who started the photography department, creative photography department, that was the origin, actually, of the MIT Media Lab. And that intersection of art and technology is now what my life is devoted to. So I remember going from one extreme to the other in terms of approach to education, and he always supported that. I mean, he always supported my studies and my work, and I haven't really thought as much as maybe I should about all the connections, the things that he did that had an influence on me. You'd think by now I might reflect more on that, but when I think of that influence as a photographer, I mean, I am a lifelong photographer. A lot of my career as a publisher is involved with publishing some of the great photographers. And that must have come from growing up watching him as an amateur photographer. And so in that sense, he was also very creative, and he clearly had a great eye. But he was also fascinated by technology, and he was also, I think, his greatest gift and talent was in creating brands, as a creator of lifestyle brands. That's one of the hardest things in the world to do, because you can't manufacture a lifestyle brand. It grows out of something very, very deep, and there are brands that also become lifestyles. Apple, Nike. And Ely is in that league, in that category. He had a divining rod for the defining passions, interests, cultural trends and lifestyle of his era. This is his greatest gift. Then he would entrepreneurially create the business and the brand, and a culture developed around it. That's why his products were so successful, because they made people happy.
That's very, very well said. And, you know, just to speak about the creativity, I mean, in my interface with him at the golf company, he was always 3 steps ahead of everybody.
Yeah.
On the creative thinking side of things. And when a new product was in development, people were throwing out names for what it might be or whatever. You know, Ely always had the final say on what the name was.
Oh, of course.
And our internal nickname, which I'm not sure he ever was aware of, was that we called him the naming committee.
Yeah, that's perfect. He wasn't. Can I take a little break?
Dad, do you want me to?
Hi, Jennifer. This is about Ely. This is not about me, but I'm thinking about all the influences. So I realized that was the defining thing for him, was to create products that make you happy. And I remember him saying, when I'd go out and play golf with him, which was quite an experience, both pre-Callaway Golf and post, he said, well, you played with him many times, so you know, and you can never play a regulation round with him because he wanted to test his clubs. He always had his pockets full of golf balls, and he'd hit a shot, and if he didn't like it, that's no good, let's hit another one, and he'd drop another ball, and then he'd hit. And he said, you know, my policy about the game of golf is hit till you're happy. So, I'm starting a new company, and I've had a company for the past 2 years called Callaway Digital Arts, and we make apps for iPad and iPhone.
My granddaughter cannot wait to get to our house to jump on the iPad to play with the Miss Spider.
Oh, how great! Wonderful.
I've followed.
Well, that's great to hear. So, Callaway Digital Arts is focusing entirely in the kids space, and my interests have always been very broad. So, I've decided to. I'm remaining as a founder and shareholder and advisor to Callaway Digital Arts, but with Ellen Johnston, our creative director at Callaway Digital Arts, as my partner, we're starting a new company. And one thing that Ely really did not tolerate was beating around the bush or spending too much time on anything. And he used to take me to task a lot for being too wordy, for taking too much time to get my message across. And once again, it was about communicating. How do you communicate? How do you communicate effectively and efficiently? And I didn't learn those lessons very well when he was alive, but I'm trying to learn it now. So I'm starting a new company, and the name of the brand is one word, 2 syllables. It's also our URL, and it's the description of our products, and it's our mission. So here it is. So there's certainly some of Ely in there. And I think finally the greatest lifestyle brands really are the ones that make you happy, that enable you to connect to your passion. And that's what defined Ely. Everything was driven by his personal passion. And anyone who knew him knew he had a genius for communicating his passion for the product and therefore for connecting people to it. And when he started Callaway Golf, it was a very unlikely venture. It was ahead of its time. And he had a hell of a time raising money. But that didn't matter because he was so passionate about it that he was able to convey that to people. And
To jump back just half a second here, when we play golf with him, we called it Ely golf.
Ely golf,
Because he
yeah.
did whatever he wanted to do.
Exactly.
I don't think in all the times that I played 2 holes or 18 holes, I don't know if I ever played 18 holes. I played whatever, how many holes he wanted.
You never played 18 holes with him. It was number 2, number 5, number 9.
I don't think I ever saw him putt. He'd have a 7-wood or a 9-wood or a new wedge or whatever it might be. So things come to an end at Burlington.
Yes.
And we don't have a lot of information of how premeditated a move to Temecula to grow grapes might have been. We have a feel.
I do. I know exactly.
touch on
It was as premeditated as could be. It was planted because he planted the vineyard 2 years before he resigned. So the proof is right there. He knew what was coming, and he made his plan B. And what was fantastic is that he had a life for the first 50 years of his life that were represented the best of what that era was, large corporate America, and then he just took off into the unknown, into the entrepreneurial unknown.
So a big difference there from corporate structure, politics, and power, and all of that, to the just, if you will, raw entrepreneur, wearing all the hats for everything that's going on. Quite a difference there. Not surprising for us in hindsight, but I'm sure at the time he may have had those moments where he said, "The hell have I done?"
Well, if he did, he would never show that, and I don't think he did. In fact, I'm sure he didn't, because he was someone who never looked back. He was someone who was able to take those great leaps of faith into the unknown, and that's a great lesson for all of us in every aspect of our lives. I think that's one of his greatest legacies, is no fear. No fear. If you jump, the net will appear. And that was maybe his great leap. I see it as his expression of the 60s spirit, because he did it I believe he planted the vineyards in 1969. And actually, the trajectory of the Beatles is a very interesting one as a parallel to sort of the intersection of the Beatles in his life, this Zelig thing. Because the Beatles ended in 1969, 1970. He took his great leap. But it was because he knew that he was not going to become the CEO. He was going to be passed over. And I think he had spent all of his life to be the boss. And he wasn't going to find it in everything that he had been working toward. And so he had the courage to say, I'm now going to become my own boss. And I'm going to connect to my heart. I am going to follow what I love. Now there's the other great lesson for all of us, is if you follow your heart and you have the courage to take the leap, to act on it, it's going to lead to a good place. And he was so happy. I actually have never seen him happier. I mean, he was a happy man, but I have never seen him happier than when he had moved to Temecula, California, and it was a crazy story that he loved to tell about moving to the desert, Riverside County, for God's sake, when everyone else was up in Napa on the recommendation of Andrei Chelychev, who was the great guru for that first generation of premium varietal winemakers who all went to Napa or Sonoma. He went to Riverside County, for God's sake, and I'll never forget driving down. I was in college, driving down. He wrote me a letter when he left Burlington. It's a wonderful letter in which he talked about why and what he was doing, and it came out of the blue. It was such a shock, and it's moving to. But once again, I mean, he saw ahead in California. He was, look at the people who followed. He created his own, he created his Sauvignon Blanc Valley before Silicon Valley. You know, way down south, he was right there. He was older than Steve Jobs, but it's fascinating to think about that the roots of Silicon Valley and the roots of Callaway Vineyards were being planted at the same time.
That's a very interesting perspective. We are going to be able to interview the original winemaker that Ely hired.
John Marmarco. He's in 2 weeks? Yep. Will you send him my love and admiration? And tell him if he's got any of those original vintages, I want some, if they're still drinkable. So it was an astonishing move. And I'll never forget driving to see him and seeing the sign for Temecula, California. I'd never been to that part of the world. It said population 275. There was nothing there except a few Butler buildings, one of which was his, and a small subdivision of tract houses. I think it cost $15,000. And so he moved from this Mies van der Rohe, Mad Men luxurious lifestyle to a tract house in the desert of Southern California. It was a very attractive tract house. I went there a couple months ago, and I passed the sign and said population 675,000. So talk about, seeing ahead. And now Callaway Vineyards is still there, but it's surrounded by miles and miles and miles and miles of it's a small city. So the other thing he said about it is that he always wanted to be a farmer. He grew up in the peach orchards in Georgia, and he was deeply connected to the land. He loved agriculture. He loved farming. He was a great gardener. This garden that he designed and planted in New Canaan, but then he loved growing vegetables and flowers, and he loved his tomatoes. So this was connecting literally to roots, and the pleasure he took in building something from below the ground up. No, he knew exactly where he was in terms of the history of. He knew he was part of and making history in California winemaking. And of course, he was doing it in a way different than everyone else. He was the contrarian.
So that the winery vineyard grows and becomes successful. And did it surprise you that there again was another shift and he sold it? Or did you expect that this might be where he was going to be his happiest and be something that would run the whole rest of his life?
Well, he was 50 when he started it. He was 63 when he sold it. I think the thought was, gee, well, he's now earned his retirement. I think he was thinking of it that way, too. And then, of course, he famously met Dick Parenti and Dick. Yes. He didn't have any master plan to become a serial entrepreneur. It came to him because of his energy. That's the other thing about him that I observed is that most people, as they age, they become ossified. Their horizons narrow, and they get stuck in their ways. Often, people get more and more comfortable in the universe that they inhabit or that they've built, and they want to stay within that. The great thing about Ely was that the older he got, because of having learned that lesson about taking leaps and how rejuvenating and rewarding what fruits that yields, then he learned that as a practice. And so his sphere, his universe expanded when most of his contemporaries were contracting. And that's also a rare quality. So he just continued his prime lasted all of his life.
And he so enjoyed the work, and as a result, it paid him back in the rewards of the success of creating the product to the financial success, but also the success born from the consumer enjoying his product. I think certainly in golf, and I'm expecting the same in wine, he loved to hear somebody come up to him and say, "Ely, I bought a Big Bertha and I love it."
Right.
You know, I mean, it didn't have to be deeper than that, but I think he drew a lot from it.
Well, I remember Hal Homeyard, his great friend from the 1950s, saying that no one who ever met Ely forgot him because he had such a great interest in people, and everyone was a potential customer. Everyone in the world. And he understood that was I call it something that I have tried to apply. He called it, I call it the chain of enthusiasm. And that chain of enthusiasm is nothing better than it starting with the maker. And then he wanted to convert every single person he met to his product. And he loved products that were unusual and contrarian so that he could convert them. Because he would say, it's fine to have someone on your side from the beginning, but the most powerful customer you can have is someone who had a preconceived notion that was not aligned with you, and that if you could bring them around to your point of view, then he said, that's a deep and powerful customer. So he loved to convert people. And of course, he came from a line of Baptist preachers. And he loved that heritage too. So he had something of the preacher spirit in him, the Southern Baptist minister. So he understood that if you connected with every single person, that chain of enthusiasm would continue to be built, and then each of those people builds it, and that never gets unbound. And that's how he continued to build his audience, and that he loved to see it grow and grow and grow until he had tens of millions of believers.
Yeah, you did a wonderful job of really expanding on that, because some have said, he was the consummate salesman. I don't think the word salesman does justice to his approach, because it's
He really wasn't a salesman.
Yeah,
He
buy
was
from me, we're done.
Right.
He was never done with you. And as the legions of people using the golf clubs or drinking the wine probably grew, he probably knew most of their names, and he had a connection with them.
He had a deep personal connection, and it was real because he loved people.
So probably a good time to talk about, we are going to interview Tony Manzoni and possibly Dick Rennie as well in the coming weeks, in kind of those early days of the golf company. But before I forget here, you had mentioned the first time that you had
Yes. Well,
We can start kind of before that.
yes. Well, it was when he.
Do you want to take a break? No, so you can.
No, I'm good.
Yeah, I got 12 minutes to take left, and I'll do a quick tape change.
Okay.
Great.
So when he sold the vineyard, it was, I thought it was a triumph because it was the full cycle of entrepreneurship and selling it to one of the world's largest liquor companies, and he seemed to just wrap it up perfectly. But then when, I think it was within a year, and he said, well, found this little golf club company called Hickory Stick USA, and I decided to buy it. Of course, to me, I understood that because I had an entire lifetime of observing him as one of who I think that Ely understood the practice and the meaning of the game of golf more deeply than anyone I have ever known. So it was perfectly natural to me. It was no surprise that he had. I said, "Oh, of course, well, yeah, this is the logical next step." But it was. I think everyone around him, myself included, radically underestimated him because it seemed like, and it was a novelty. And the idea, and it was a retro novelty. There was a technology element to it, i.e., the steel shaft drilled through a hickory stick, but and he tried to tell, of course, convert people to that it was the combination of the new and the old that made it so special. But it was a little. It seemed like a wonderful retirement occupation. And as he said he bought the company, and they were in 1,000 square feet, and where was it, in Cathedral City, and on sawhorse tables, and so he was starting all over again. But having watched him do that 15 years earlier at Callaway Golf, it made sense. He's an entrepreneur, and a great one already. So for the first few years, it was always, oh, that's nice, the hickory sticks, and yeah, let's play with them and stuff. And I continued to play golf all my life. I wasn't very interested in it. For my generation, golf was very uncool in the 60s and 70s. And of course, Ely made it the coolest game on the planet in the 90s. And look what's happened since. Oh my God. Now, the NBA and NFL draft, they're trying to decide, are they going to go for basketball or football or golf? That's just so amazing. That's part of the legacy of Ely. So my ritual with Ely, I had now had 15 years of going to California, which of course had an influence on me, then ultimately starting a Silicon Valley company. But I had a life visiting him and observing what California was all about. After the first part of my life that he epitomized what New York was all about. And then he epitomized what California was all about. Now think about that. I mean, again, it's a wonderful occasion to think about the influence on my life, but I've got a company, Callaway Digital Arts, that's trying to unite the sensibilities of what makes New York great and what makes California great. And I hadn't thought about that either, that he showed the way. He lived the way of both. So one of my rituals from college onward was going out, and even in the wine years. I mean, he was a member of El Dorado, and then Del Mar, and And the Vintage Club, yes. So being with Ely was playing golf and going out to dinner, and so we'd always play. And for those first few years, it was the hickory sticks, and they were great. Then one day we were at, I think it was at the Vintage, and he had a whole bag full of clubs, and there were head covers on them, and they looked really different from the hickory sticks. And I guess, let's see, what came first? There was a set. Were there a set of iron? Was the S2H2s? Were they?
S2H2 woods and irons
Yeah.
were the immediate predecessor.
Of Big Bertha, right? So I knew
Actually, I take that back. For a short while, there was a product in there called the Bobby Jones driver.
the Bobby Jones driver. Yes,
Face driver than S2H2,
exactly,
but not
exactly.
not
So he was going into the irons and the metal woods business, but then he had this bag full of unusual looking clubs. So he said, "Nikki, we're about to come out with a new club, and these are the first prototypes, and I want you to try it out and tell me what you think." And he said, "I've given it a name, and I want to." So I said, "Well, land it on me." He said, "I'm going to call it the Big Bertha. What do you think?" And I said, "I think it's the worst name for a product I've ever heard." And he said, he said, "Well, you're wrong." He said, "First of all, this club is going to transform the golf industry. This is going to be the biggest selling golf club in the world a year from now." And he said, "And you're wrong about the name, because it has a story. And when a product tells a story, it's a good thing." And then he told me the story of the Big Bertha. I said, "I still think it's the worst name I've ever heard for a product." And I was actually thinking of women. I was thinking, what woman wants to play with a club? Most women don't identify with the name Bertha. So he said, "I guarantee you it's going to be the biggest selling golf club a year from now." And he said, "Remember, the product makes the name doesn't make the product." And I've always remembered that, because it was so just an absolute truth. He said, so test out the product, see if it will make the name." And so I stepped up and I hit the ball, and it made a really strange sound on impact. And I looked down, and the ball had dribbled off the tee, and the club head had flown off the shaft and gone about 30 yards. And he said, "Well, we're still working out some of the gluing problems, because, the hosel is really low, and it's low center of gravity," and started to explain it. And he said, I guarantee it's going to be the biggest selling golf club in the world." And he was so right.
that's a phenomenal story.
That's it. I'm going to change tape, guys.
Okay.
That was a great story. Guys, tell us.
And we can do it again if you want. I mean, we can have another session. There's a lot to say. There's a lot to say.
So I think we're at the point here where, maybe touch on that successor,
sure.
not letting go part of things,
Mm-hmm.
and then to just summary is not the right word, but just a reflection on all of it,
Mm-hmm.
in a way, and the man in the process. So first the successor and there at that part.
I think that, and everyone talks about in building a company and organization, about succession. A great company, a great brand is always a reflection of the personality, the talents, the passion of someone like Ely Callaway. You can't hire that. You can't manufacture it. You can't, because it's magic. You know, that's why everyone knows you can't replace Steve Jobs. He built something. His last laugh was that, because he lived for 7 years staring down death, and he had a plan. Talk about seeing ahead. Oh my goodness. He saw ahead 20 to 30 years. Ely saw ahead 10 to 20. But Steve's last laugh was, he said, while people don't recognize it, I'm going to build, because of the scale of the company, which of course, since his death, has become the world's most valuable company, consistently. He said, I'm going to build a company that's so deep that it's going to last a long, long time. And that's what he devoted, I think, most of his energy to. Ely didn't do that, because I think he was the true entrepreneur. He loved building things up. Maybe it's because he started his career running a Fortune 50 company, knew what the large corporate culture was like. That, by the way, gave him the tools then, unique tools to be able to then build companies, because he knew all the stages that you would then go through. That's so rare. So having come from corporate America, then to becoming an entrepreneur. But I think he wasn't interested in that, maybe even. He had left that behind. He wanted to start and build companies, and it was so much an expression of him that I don't think, in that sense, I think he kind of assumed, well, we've got great people, and they're all around me, and they'll keep going, and it'll be great. But he underestimated the extent to which, when he passed, that it would fall apart. And the proof is that each one of his businesses fell apart. By fall apart, I mean they either disappeared, literally. Burlington Industries and the American textile industry no longer exists. And he saw it coming in 1960 with Akio Morita on the U.S.-Japan Trade Council, was the first one to say, the Japanese are coming and watch out. That was 20 years ahead, actually. Then Callaway Vineyards, I think he assumed, well, it's one of the great liquor corporations and it's going to do fine, but then it literally was decimated by causes natural and man-made. And Callaway Golf, as we can see, even building the world's largest golf club company, $1 billion company, in relative terms, as we know, that's still, I mean, that's amazing, but it's still small compared to a Google and Apple and Amazon in terms of corporate management. And it is still finally a niche industry. We had a lot of talks about how to grow the business, because I recognized that it was still finally a niche business, a business that he expanded radically, but still he almost made it larger than what it naturally wanted to be, as shown by the fact that it's kind of contracting, or it stays static, right? So we talked a lot about what he called diversification, meaning diversification and growth, because you could think of so many ways that Callaway Golf, as a true lifestyle brand, could have then used golf as the core experience to become a Nike, to go into other sports, real estate, because the rise of golf and real estate went hand in hand, travel. There are so many ways that if you had that vision, that Callaway Golf could have become a much, much larger company. But he was resolutely focused for, I'm not sure if he was, you could argue both ways, but he was, we're going to do basically one thing, and we're going to do it better than anyone in the world.
He made that very clear.
Yeah.
In the company.
He never wavered from that. So, but maybe in summing it all up, you are what you make. The magic, a lot of the happiness of this time resides in places where he found it and created it, in wine and golf and what you wear and the art of living. He was a master of the art of living.
I like that a great deal, and certainly see that. So, on reflection here a little bit, and comment as you care to on that. So, the great entrepreneur succeeded beyond many, many levels of expectation at the golf company, and both you and your brother especially are very entrepreneurial. And for many outsiders that might not know you, well, they didn't necessarily connect you to the golf equipment business. They view you both as dyed-in-the-wool entrepreneurs, kind of like Dad.
And that's the Ely's vindication, because he also hated nepotism. He believed that family members should not be in business together, and he insisted always that we find our own path. Anyway, but
No, that's exactly, that's an interesting part of it, but you and Reese both have become very successful entrepreneurs and have that creative gene, gear, or whatever you want to call it, to work with the right people, to deliver a product that people want. There's as we dig into this, we see a lot of similarities there, and I just was wondering how you might look at that now, at this stage of your life, and say,
thank you, Daps.
yeah.
Daps was the name that we called him. So that's a great gift. Try to, in my own way, carry on his spirit.
Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Beautifully done.
I think it was really good.
Are you a writer, Nicholas?
I first wanted to be a writer, and I do write, but I decided to be an editor for artists and writers in my publishing career more than writing myself.
You communicate very beautifully, for lack of another word. I love the way you use words and the words you use.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, very eloquent. Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean that. I was listening to the whole thing.
Well, I've had a lot of time to think about him. And I do, it's a wonderful thank you for, you have brought to the surface so many things by coming at this moment that are happening in my own life. So thank you for that. I got a lot to think about
Well, it's
and reflect on.
I
All right. Yeah. So naming, inventing products and naming and transforming industries, that all requires a word that is hackneyed, which is vision. And he had true vision, and he saw ahead, I think, between 10 and 20 years. And the other great person of our time who had that, of course, was Steve Jobs. And I think there are tremendous parallels between Ely and Steve in many, many ways. Ely was much nicer than Steve. He was not as ruthless. He was determined, but he wasn't ruthless, and he wasn't interested in that. But they shared so many qualities, and it's interesting that Ely was doing it down in Southern California, and Steve was up in Silicon Valley. And he always admired Steve. He told a great story about why he went into the golf business. He said, I went into the golf business because it was so bad. He said it was filled with products that hadn't changed in a long time, and sleepy people, and terribly run businesses. He said, I knew it would be so easy to succeed. He said, I never could have done what Steve Jobs did. That's an industry filled with geniuses.
That sounds, I can, as you say that, I can nearly hear him say that.
Geniuses.
That is remarkable. Well, the success of the company certainly was probably even for him a bit unexpected. The rocket ship ride that it became. And, we've talked to a few people about the going public part of it, but one thing that came about here is that now Ely's in his 70s.
Yeah.
And he's got the energy of any young man, maybe more energy than most. And coming to work early and moving along and continuing to grow and enjoy the business and the many people that were benefiting from it, whether it's shareholders, employees, people that he was grooming or whatever. But he never really appointed a real successor and mentored or guided that process at all. And did that surprise you? Because he appointed Don Dye, and then Don was gone, and then Ely came back, and then Chuck Yash left, and Ely came back. And it was almost as if he couldn't really let go, or maybe he didn't find the right person. And I don't know how to even explain my view of it. And I was there, and I don't understand how to explain it. But any thoughts you might have on it was such a rocket ship, whoever wanted to get off?
Right.
I mean.
Could we take one break for a second? Because I have to wake my son up. And